December 19th, 1941. Joseph Stalin stood at a window in the Kremlin, watching snow fall over Moscow. German artillery could be heard in the distance, close enough that the sound carried through the frozen air. The Wehrmacht had reached the city's outskirts. Soviet casualties had already exceeded 800,000 men. And now, threading through the streets below, came something Stalin had never expected to see in the capital of world socialism. A column of American tanks, their white stars barely visible beneath layers of ice and grime. He said nothing at first, just watched. The tanks moved slowly, their tracks clanking against cobblestones, exhaust rising in white plumes. M3 Stuarts, light tanks that looked almost toy-like compared to the German panzers his armies had been facing. Behind them came the bigger M3 Lees, medium tanks with their strange multi-level design, main gun mounted in a sponson on the right side of the hull. American machines built in Detroit and shipped across half the world to defend Moscow. What Stalin said in that moment would depend on who you asked. The official Soviet record, when it mentioned the incident at all, claimed he nodded approvingly and remarked on the fraternal solidarity of the anti-fascist alliance. American diplomats who met with him that week reported something different, a grudging acknowledgement that the tanks had arrived, delivered with barely concealed resentment that the Soviet Union needed them at all. Soviet tank officers, who would later crew these machines, told another story entirely. That Stalin's first concern was whether the tanks were actually any good, whether American capitalism could produce weapons that matched German engineering. The truth was probably all of these things at once. Stalin was a man who contained multitudes of contradictions, who could be pragmatic and ideological, grateful and resentful, impressed and dismissive, sometimes within the same conversation. But to understand what those American tanks meant, you have to go back 4 months earlier, to a moment when Stalin believed he didn't need Western help at all. June 22nd, 1941. 3 million German soldiers crashed across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Stalin had ignored dozens of warnings. He'd believed Hitler wouldn't be foolish enough to fight a two-front war. He'd convinced himself that German troop buildups were a bluff, that his non-aggression pact would hold, that he had more time to prepare. He was wrong. Within days, entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. The Red Air Force lost over 1,200 aircraft in the first 9 hours. German panzers drove so deep so fast that Soviet commanders couldn't keep track of where the front line was anymore. Minsk fell. Smolensk fell. By September, Leningrad was under siege, and German armies were driving toward Moscow. Stalin's initial response was near paralysis. For almost 2 weeks after the invasion, he barely appeared in public. When he finally addressed the nation on July 3rd, his voice carried an unfamiliar quality, uncertainty. "A grave danger hangs over our country," he said. Not the confident declarations of inevitable socialist victory, but an admission that the Soviet Union might actually lose. And in that moment of crisis, help arrived from the most unexpected source, the capitalist West. Britain had already been fighting Germany alone for over a year. Winston Churchill, who had spent his entire political career opposing Bolshevism, who had advocated strangling the Soviet Union in its cradle back in 1918, made a calculation. "If Hitler invaded hell," Churchill said, "I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. The enemy of my enemy, even if that enemy was Stalin." But Britain was already stretched thin, its own survival dependent on American aid. The real question was whether the United States would help. And that decision rested with Franklin Roosevelt, who was trying to support Britain while keeping America officially neutral, who faced an American public that wanted nothing to do with another European war, who was dealing with a Congress that viewed Stalin's regime as barely better than Hitler's. Roosevelt's solution was Lend-Lease, a program that let him send weapons to allies without calling it a sale, without requiring immediate payment, without technically violating neutrality. "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire," Roosevelt explained to the American public, "and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire." The program had been designed for Britain, but after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Roosevelt made a choice that shocked many Americans. He extended Lend-Lease to Stalin. On August 2, 1941, less than 6 weeks after the German invasion, Roosevelt announced that the United States would provide military aid to the USSR. Stalin's response was immediate and blunt. "Send everything. Send it now." Soviet purchasing agents in Washington submitted lists of needed supplies that read like fever dreams. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, locomotives, rails, telephone wire, machine tools, aluminum, steel, explosives, food, boots, medicine, millions of tons of everything. The Americans and British sent a delegation to Moscow to negotiate specifics. Averell Harriman represented the United States, a wealthy businessman turned diplomat who found himself sitting across from Stalin in the Kremlin, discussing how many tanks and planes America could deliver. Stalin chain-smoked throughout the meeting, pacing the room, occasionally stopping to stare at maps showing the German advance. "The situation is grave," Stalin told Harriman. Not an admission he made easily. "We need immediate help. Not promises. Actual weapons. Now." Harriman tried to explain logistics. America's own military was tiny, still mobilizing. Factories were just beginning to convert to war production. The British had priority because they'd been fighting longer. Shipping routes across the Atlantic were contested by U-boats. Getting supplies to the Soviet Union would require... Stalin cut him off. "Every month of delay costs us hundreds of thousands of men. Your factories are safe. Ours are being overrun. We need tanks. We need aircraft. How many can you send?" They settled on the first protocol: 400 aircraft per month, 500 tanks per month, plus raw materials and other supplies. The agreement was signed October 1st, 1941, with delivery to begin immediately. Immediately turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. The problem was geography. The Soviet Union and the United States didn't share a border. Getting American weapons to Soviet forces meant shipping them across thousands of miles of contested ocean and hostile territory. 3 routes emerged, each with its own nightmares. The Arctic route ran from American ports to Britain, then north around Norway to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, Soviet ports on the Barents Sea. The convoys faced German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft operating from occupied Norway. They sailed through some of the most brutal weather on Earth, where waves could snap a ship in half and ice could accumulate so fast on a deck that vessels capsized from the weight. The Pacific route ran from American West Coast ports to Vladivostok. It was safer from German attack, but required Soviet ships, since America wasn't at war with Japan yet and couldn't risk American vessels in Japanese-controlled waters. Even after Pearl Harbor, this route remained politically sensitive, and Vladivostok was 6,000 miles from Moscow, across the Trans-Siberian Railway that was already strained beyond capacity. The Persian Corridor route ran from American ports through the Indian Ocean to Iran, then overland through Iran to Soviet territory. But Iran was neutral and had to be occupied first. British and Soviet forces invaded Iran in August 1941, overthrew the government, and spent months building the infrastructure needed to move supplies north. None of these routes would be fully operational before winter. And winter was when the Germans reached Moscow. The first American tanks to reach the Soviet Union arrived in early November 1941, shipped through the Arctic to Arkhangelsk. 20-odd M3 Stuarts, light tanks weighing just over 13 tons, armed with a 37mm main gun and 3 machine guns. They were loaded onto rail cars and shipped south toward Moscow. Soviet tank officers inspected them with skepticism. The M3 Stuart was smaller than Soviet light tanks, more cramped inside, Its armor was thin, just over an inch at the thickest points. The 37mm gun was adequate against light vehicles, but struggled against German medium tanks. Soviet crews nicknamed it the Brat, little brother, both affectionate and dismissive. But the Stuart had qualities that Soviet tanks lacked. It was reliable. Its engine started in cold weather that killed Soviet tanks. Its transmission didn't break down every 50 miles. It had a radio in every tank, not just command vehicles. The crew compartment was better designed, easier to work in, with better visibility. American tankers would have called it cramped. Soviet crews thought it was spacious compared to their own vehicles. Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, who would become one of the most successful Soviet tank commanders of the war, first encountered American tanks in December 1941. "We approached with curiosity and skepticism," he later wrote. "They looked strange to us. The angles were different. The hatches opened differently. Everything felt foreign." His crew climbed inside a Stuart, tested the controls, started the engine. "It started immediately," Loza remembered. "In winter. First try." We looked at each other. This was unusual. The bigger M3 Lee medium tanks arrived around the same time. These were stranger still. The Lee had two main guns, a 75mm in a sponson on the right side of the hull and a 37mm in a small turret on top. The design was a compromise, created because American engineers couldn't yet fit a 75mm gun in a rotating turret. The result was a tank that stood over 10 feet tall, had limited traverse for its main gun, and presented a massive target. Soviet crews hated it immediately. "A grave for 7 brothers," they called it, referring to the crew size. The high profile made it easy for German gunners to hit. The sponson-mounted main gun meant you couldn't fire without exposing the entire tank. The riveted armor had a tendency to spall. When shells hit, rivets would break loose inside and ricochet around the crew compartment like bullets. But Stalin didn't care about crew opinions. He cared about numbers. The Germans were at the gates of Moscow. Soviet tank production had collapsed as factories were evacuated east, ahead of the German advance. The Red Army was desperately short of armor. American tanks, whatever their flaws, were better than no tanks at all. The first convoy to reach Moscow itself arrived in mid-December, just as Soviet forces were launching their counter-offensive. The timing was coincidental, but symbolically perfect. As German troops began their first retreat of the war, American tanks rolled through Red Square. That's when Stalin came to the window and watched them pass. What he said depends on which account you trust. Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, claimed Stalin remarked, "Roosevelt has finally made good on his promise. Now we'll see if American workers can build weapons as well as they build cars." A backhanded compliment at best, acknowledging the aid while questioning its quality. Anastas Mikoyan, another Politburo member, remembered it differently. "They've sent us their obsolete junk, but junk is better than nothing." Stalin apparently said this with a slight smile, recognizing the irony that the world's largest socialist state was being saved by capitalist production. American diplomat William Stanley, who met with Stalin shortly after the tanks arrived, reported that Stalin expressed satisfaction that the Americans had kept their schedule but immediately pressed for more. "The protocol specifies 500 tanks per month. I count 20 here. Where are the rest?" Soviet tank crews who were there tell another version. They claim Stalin came to inspect the tanks personally, walked around an M3 Lee, climbed up to look inside, then climbed down and asked the assembled officers, "Can we make this?" When told that Soviet factories were already producing superior designs, he allegedly said, "Then why are we accepting these?" The answer, though no one said it to his face, was that Soviet factories weren't producing anything at the moment. They were being evacuated or overrun. The most reliable account comes from Avril Harriman's notes. Harriman met with Stalin on December 23rd, 4 days after the tanks arrived. Stalin acknowledged their arrival briefly, then spent the meeting demanding more tanks, more aircraft, more trucks, more aluminum. "You have given us 20 tanks," Stalin said. "The Germans have 2,000 tanks around Moscow. You see the disparity." Harriman tried to explain that more were coming, that convoys were at sea, that production was ramping up. Stalin cut him off with a question that revealed his deeper concern. "Will you continue to send supplies if we're pushed back beyond the Urals, if Moscow falls, if we're reduced to guerrilla warfare?" It was the question that haunted Stalin throughout that winter. Lend-Lease was predicated on the Soviet Union surviving as an organized state, continuing to tie down German divisions that might otherwise be used against Britain or eventually against American forces. If the Soviet Union collapsed, the aid would stop. Stalin knew this. It made every American tank, every British aircraft, a reminder of Soviet dependence. "We will continue to send supplies as long as you continue to fight," Harriman assured him. "The President has committed to this." Stalin nodded slowly, drew on his cigarette, and said something that Harriman recorded in his notes, but that never made it into official Soviet histories. "Then we are in your debt. I dislike debt." This was the complexity of Stalin's reaction to American aid. He needed it desperately. He resented needing it. He was grateful for it. He suspected American motives. He wanted more of it. He wanted to prove he didn't need it. All of these feelings coexisted, shifting in emphasis depending on the day, the audience, the military situation. Over the following months, as more American tanks arrived, Soviet crews developed nuanced opinions. The M3 Stuart light tanks proved useful for reconnaissance and infantry support, where their reliability mattered more than their armor. The M3 Lee mediums were relegated to secondary sectors or training units, considered too vulnerable for frontline combat. But in early 1942, when Soviet tank strength was at its lowest, even the Lees saw action defending Moscow and later in the fighting around Kharkov. Then the M4 Shermans started arriving. The Sherman was everything the Lee wasn't: lower profile, fully rotating turret, better armor, more reliable. Soviet crews called it MSHA, their pronunciation of M4C. Unlike the Lee, which they mocked, the Sherman earned respect. Dmitry Loza, who commanded a Sherman unit, later wrote, "The Sherman was the best tank for our conditions, not because it was better armed or armored than German tanks. It wasn't, but because it worked. It started in winter. It didn't break down. The crew could fight in it for hours without exhaustion." Soviet tankers particularly appreciated features that American crews took for granted. The electric turret traverse, which meant you didn't have to hand crank the turret around. The gyro stabilizer, which helped keep the gun on target while moving. The wet ammunition storage, which reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. The spring-loaded hatches, which could be opened quickly for escape, but they also noted its weaknesses. The Sherman's 75mm gun struggled against heavy German armor. Its gasoline engine was a fire hazard compared to Soviet diesel engines. Its high profile made it easier to spot and hit. Soviet crews added extra armor plates, sandbags, spare track links, anything to improve survivability. By mid-1942, American tanks were arriving in significant numbers. Over 3,000 Shermans would eventually reach the Soviet Union, along with over 1,000 M3 Lees and nearly 2,000 M3 Stuarts. They represented about 15% of Soviet tank strength, a significant but not decisive proportion. Stalin's public statements about Lend-Lease remained carefully calibrated. In speeches to the Soviet people, he emphasized Soviet production and Soviet sacrifice, barely mentioning Allied aid. In diplomatic meetings with American and British officials, he acknowledged the aid but always coupled it with demands for more, or complaints about delays, or suggestions that a second front in Europe would be more helpful than supplies. But privately, to his inner circle, Stalin was more candid. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later become Soviet premier, recalled a conversation from 1943. Stalin admitted that without American trucks, we wouldn't have been able to move our artillery. Without American aluminum, we couldn't have built our aircraft. Without American food, we would have starved. The famous quote attributed to Stalin, "Without American production, the United Nations could never have won the war," comes from a conversation with Harriman near the war's end. But Stalin said it in private, and Soviet historians would spend decades downplaying Lend-Lease's importance, claiming the USSR would have won regardless. The truth was more complex. Soviet industrial production, once factories were evacuated and re-established beyond the Urals, outstripped German production. Soviet tank designs, particularly the T-34, were superior to most American tanks in armor and firepower. Soviet armies did the bulk of the fighting against Germany, suffering the vast majority of casualties. The Soviet Union would likely have defeated Germany without Lend-Lease, but the war would have lasted longer and cost millions more Soviet lives. American tanks were never the most important part of Lend-Lease. Trucks mattered more. Over 400,000 American trucks gave Soviet armies mobility that German forces lacked. Food mattered more. Millions of tons of American food helped prevent mass starvation. Raw materials mattered more. American aluminum, copper, and steel fed Soviet war production. But tanks were visible. Tanks were symbolic. When American tanks rolled through Moscow in December 1941, they represented something beyond their military value, proof that the Soviet Union wasn't alone, that the capitalist West would help defeat fascism despite ideological differences, that Stalin's desperate gamble to accept aid from historical enemies had paid off. What Stalin said when he saw those first American tanks mattered less than what he did. He accepted them, deployed them, demanded more, and never publicly admitted how much the Soviet Union needed them. This was Stalin's way. Pride and pragmatism in constant tension, gratitude expressed as demand, dependence disguised as criticism. Lieutenant Loza, the tank commander who spent years fighting in American Shermans, perhaps put it best in his memoirs. "We knew the tanks were American. We saw the English instructions, the American markings barely painted over, but we were told to consider them Soviet tanks, built by Soviet workers, part of Soviet production." This was the official line. We understood why. National pride required it. But in the tank, when the engine started reliably in -40-degree cold, when the radio worked, when the gun fired accurately, we knew the truth, and we were grateful, even if we couldn't say so. The first convoy of American tanks arrived in Moscow during the city's darkest hour, when German artillery could be heard from the Kremlin, when Soviet casualties were mounting toward 1 million, when the survival of the Soviet state hung in balance. They arrived not as saviors, but as reinforcements, not as a solution, but as a supplement to Soviet resistance. Stalin watched them pass through snow-covered streets and said something, we'll never know exactly what, that captured his complicated relationship with American aid. Necessary, but resented, appreciated, but never quite acknowledged. Crucial, but never decisive. He needed those tanks. He hated needing them. He used them effectively. He minimized their importance. He was grateful. He was proud. He was Stalin, containing multitudes of contradictions, surviving through pragmatism while maintaining ideological purity, accepting help from capitalists while planning for the inevitable conflict after the war. The tanks rolled through Red Square, their American stars painted over with Soviet red stars, their crews speaking Russian, their origins gradually erased from official history. But they were there, in that desperate winter, when Moscow held and the German advance stopped and the tide of the war began its slow turn. American steel, Soviet blood, British determination, all mixed together in the grinding arithmetic of total war. What Stalin said mattered less than what happened next. The Soviet Union survived, pushed back, advanced, and eventually planted its flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. American tanks were part of that story, a supporting role in a Soviet narrative, acknowledged in private but minimized in public, remembered by the men who fought in them but forgotten in official histories. History is written by the victors, and the Soviet Union won. The story of American aid became a footnote, an embarrassing reminder of dependence that didn't fit the narrative of Soviet self-sufficiency and inevitable socialist triumph. But the men who were there, who saw those first tanks arrive in Moscow, who fought in them through the long years of advance from Moscow to Berlin, they remembered. They knew what those tanks meant, what Stalin said or didn't say, what it felt like to climb into an American machine and drive it into battle under a Soviet flag. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single quote could capture.